I lead our explorations team, and that's really the home for Futures and Foresight activity here at Nesta. In a minute, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what to expect from this evening. But first, I thought I'd explain why it is that Nesta thinks futures is important and worth investing in. So you were probably expecting something quite forward-looking from this event, but I'm actually going to take you back a few millennia first. So this is Cassandra, if we could move on a slide. And if we've got any classicists in the room, you'll be familiar with her from Greek mythology. Apollo gave her the gift of prophecy, but also a curse, that nobody would ever believe the futures that she foretold. Her warning about the Trojan War and, in particular, a wooden horse were all ignored. And I don't think it's a spoiler to say that, like many women in Greek mythology, she came to a very unhappy end. But I tell you Cassandra's story not only because it's a reminder of just how thankless a task it is telling people things they don't want to hear, but also because it's a reminder of the root of our fascination with the future, all the way back to the existence of ancient practices which supposedly helped mystics and prophets to divine what was fated to happen in the future. Thank you. And that's linked to the roots of the word divine. It was about discovering the will of the gods. And throughout history, humans have been pretty creative in looking for ways to divine the future, interpreting dreams, fortune-telling, even watching the way cheese coagulates. It's a thing, I promise. The interesting thing about this worldview is that it conceives of the future as being predetermined, and secondly, the idea that divining it is the preserve of the elite few. And it's only really in the past century that future studies has countered this idea by showing that you can use robust methods, you can be transparent in those methods, and you can also open up the process to a wider group of people. And it's really that last idea, creating more inclusive ways for people to participate in dialogue about the future, which we're going to focus on this evening. Now, the perception that futurology is a closed, elitist practice is not actually confined to antiquity. It's persisted, and we'll be arguing tonight that it's problematic in quite a few ways. Many of you will be aware from the 1940s onwards that there was a strong association between futures and the military, and also futures and corporate strategy. And at times, this has reinforced the perception that futures is somehow remote or opaque in its practices. Many of you will have heard of the US think tank RAND, which was founded after the Second World War and initially focused on the future of military strategy for the US Army. And another well-known incubator, of course, of futures was Shell, who famously have been working on scenarios for the past 50 years. But while organizations with a need for secrecy, like Shell and RAND, might be prominent users of futures, they're only one small part of the story of futures studies. And if you're interested in getting that broader view, I really recommend Professor Wendell Bell and Wendy Schultz's work on the history of future studies. But you'll see from their analysis why it's such a misconception that forecasting and futures just belongs to the military and to corporate strategists. And another problematic kind of myth in relation to futures is the one of the lone visionary. Not only are such heroic individuals able to anticipate things the rest of us can't, but they're also able to perhaps single-handedly bring those futures into being. And it's really the emergence of a new generation of Silicon Valley billionaires which is feeding this myth that the future is in the hands of a few brilliant tech entrepreneurs. So some of you may know that Elon Musk is planning to colonize Mars to save humanity in the event of another world war. But does it actually matter if it looks like a closed group of people are debating and defining our future? Well, it presents actually a bit more than just an image problem. As I said at the beginning, it starts to feed a more fundamental disconnect. The perception that the future was being determined by a closed global elite is arguably fueling the rise of populism and mistrust of democracy. And this creates actually a real imperative for us to start to produce alternative futures, alternative stories that people feel more of a sense of ownership over. So this is where I think it's useful for us to briefly touch on some of the core principles of future studies, and it will be much briefer than it should be. But these words, possible, probable, and preferable, if you've worked in futures, which I'm sure many of you have, you'll know that they're absolutely key to the thinking of many influential futurists, and you'll be hearing those words a lot this evening. So just to illustrate this for you visually, this is an image from a Nesta publication by Jessica Bland and Stian Westlake. Futurists are interested in what could be, so extrapolating from current trends to look at possible futures. They're interested in what is likely, so probable futures, and also what is desirable, so preferable futures. Tonight we'll probably be focusing more on tools which are associated with exploring possible and probable futures. But before we do that, I wanted to spend just a few minutes talking about the importance of articulating preferable visions of the future, which is really one of the most crucial functions. So does anyone know what this is a map of? There is absolutely no prize involved. It's actually a trick question anyway. So this is a map of nowhere. When Thomas More wrote Utopia, of course, he combined two Greek words. So translated, it literally means no place, so nowhere. He also spawned a whole genre of utopian thinking, which really look at society as it could be or as it should be. But there's also, of course, the counterpart of utopias, dystopias, and they're an equally powerful force in helping us to reflect on undesirable futures. Arguably, at the moment, we're completely inundated with dystopian visions of the future, but utopian ones are somewhat thinner on the ground. The problem is, of course, if you don't articulate preferred futures, it creates something of a vacuum. In her brilliant book, Ruth Levitas recently argued that sociologists must actually reclaim utopia as a method for collective engagement. But the question of who has a voice and who defines the values behind futures exercise is a really important one that we'll be coming to later. The future is also political, and it's an inherently political act to consider how society might be in the future. After all, one person's utopia is another person's dystopia. In Utopia for Realists, Rutger Bregman argues that we've lost the art of utopian thinking, but that it's actually fundamental to human progress and also to healthy democracies. Nesta's own very modest contribution to this act of collective futures making and preferred futures is FutureFest. If you were at the festival this July, you'll remember the theme this year was all about an invitation to occupy alternative futures, so very much a nod to some of those core principles of futures. In the design of the festival, we try to conjure with possible and preferable futures. You might have visited the Subterranean Garden, where you could explore a world where we have a healthier relationship between nature in our cities. Or you might have played in the more dystopian data casino, where we were testing how much personal data people were willing to gamble with. Answer, a lot. But while I admit we do host plenty of technologists and politicians at FutureFest, we're constantly looking for more creative ways to open up futures to more people. So this evening, we really want to try and share some of the insights from having done that and what's worked and what hasn't worked quite so well. So just to bring this together for a moment, we should be wary of visions of the future which seem definitive, where we're unclear how they were developed and whose interests they serve. One of the core purposes of future studies is to interrogate possible, preferable, and probable futures to help us visualize alternative paths. Any debate about our collective future is likely to be political with a small p. It's about tensions and trade-offs, and futures is intended to be applied to messy real-world problems. And finally, futures researchers and practitioners have given us a whole host of tools and methods which we can use to have more open conversations about the futures. And we're hoping to share some of those with you tonight.